Welcome back to Trinity Place for the 6th Sunday of Easter. For the 6th Sunday of Epiphany season, I guess the text might be the book of Acts, chapter 17, verses 22 through 31, among other things. But I'm pretty sure I have shared this story before, and even if not, you likely have read about it. It involves someone with a mixed reputation in these days of hyper-scrutiny, but it is too compelling with this collection of readings that we have for this 6th Sunday of Easter, not to poke at it a little bit, so I will. Now, in her mind, which I would not question when it comes to this, Jesus appeared to Mother Teresa and told her to leave her teaching gig and go to serve, quote, the poorest of the poor. Now, even poverty has a hierarchy, and if you've never seen the bottom of that ladder up close, believe me, no one desires to be sent to the poorest of the poor, even as a helper. Mother Teresa was a Yugoslavian Roman Catholic nun who lived and worked in India for 50 years, last century's India, Calcutta to be exact. And as you know, she started an order of nuns that still serve in some of the poorest neighborhoods of the world. Nuns catch a lot of shade in the popular imagination and a predictable amount of humor and disregard from many who grew up in Catholic schools in the mid-20th century. But I've known nuns and orders of nuns who deserve enormous respect for their courage, for the progressive theology, and for the love of people and planet that they show in daily life and work. So don't let what you may or may not associate with nuns and abuses of the Roman Catholic Church allow you to miss the wisdom embedded in Mother Teresa's story. Having a clear vision from a direct revelation from God over the course of the next 40 years, Mother Teresa heard nothing. She heard nothing in response to her prayers. Nada. Nothing. Silence. No signal. Simply silence from God. Here's an excerpt from her journal. Lord, my God, who am I that you should forsake me? The child of your love, and now become the most hated one, unloved? I call, I cling, I want, and there is no one to answer, no one on whom I can cling, no one, alone. Where is my faith? Even deep down, right in there is nothing but emptiness and darkness. My God, how painful is this unknown pain. I have no faith. I dare not utter the words and thoughts that crowd my heart and make me suffer untold agony. And in spite of that, for 4 decades, in spiritual loneliness and pain, she seems to have shuffled into death, confident about God's fidelity to her. She would later write about becoming a stubby pencil held in the elegant fingers of an authoring God, writing a love letter to the world. tormented by God's silence. She was utterly convinced that this mute God was using her life to ink a love letter to the world. Now, some would say that that's astonishing and a magnificence beyond words. Some would say that it's demented and a tragic story. Some would say that it's pathetic and a brutal violation of reason. Anyone who has read about the lives of mystics, prophets, and poets from just about any religion will say that it's par for the course. Now, I suspect all of us are like Mother Teresa in at least two ways. First, our personal encounters with the holy are precious, few and far between. And second, that whatever our relationship with God, it would likely appear ludicrous or desperate to much of the culture that surrounds us. And that brings us to Paul in that book of Acts, where Paul is in Athens. Paul, someone I almost never talk about. Paul was invited to make his case before the intellectual elite of Athens in a sacred citadel, utterly drenched with what was to become the history of Western civilization's founding thinkers. And while the Athenians of Paul's day apparently courted newness and originality, there's nothing in the book of Acts or from history that would indicate or make us believe that Paul received anything but sneers and jeers. Sneers and jeers, the way Mother Teresa was before her death, sneers and jeers. The way you and I would be sneered at and jeered by many people in many places. Paul quotes a poem from Epimenides of Crete, where he says, "We live and move and have our being in you." It was a poem referring to Zeus rather than Yahweh, and he used it, the original poet used it to reject the popular culture of Crete. Well, we live in a culture and a moment in history in which encounters with God are suspect. Indeed, even here, where we're one of our party here to burst through the door, animated and gushing about a message from God, the rest of us would likely look at one another and wonder if he or she had gone around the bend. Heck, 2 summers ago, under our tent that we had for pandemic worship, someone did stop by with what they considered a message from God, and it didn't go all that well. Let's face it, our personal spiritual experiences, whether big or small, vigorous or fragile, are lived out amidst a background of truth that does not include God. Now, please, do not hear this as some resentful social grievance from a Christian preacher, a rant. I'm not angry or resentful, nor am I insistent that faith should have its day in court. I fully understand why we have so little credibility in the public square. And it's okay with me. And I hope it doesn't bother you too much either. What does matter, I think, is that we as Christians come to terms with our post-Christian, post-religious, post-modern culture and learn how to be at peace in our own skins. And we need to learn how to talk about our encounters with the holy out loud and in a non-religious language. We have a kind of ergopolis in the 21st century, and it's this. Whereas revelation and tradition have been the two supporting columns of Christian faith, they are rejected as sources of truth in our culture. While messages from God and the accumulated teachings of religious elders once formed the starting place for inquiry and the search for truth, they are utterly irrelevant in the 21st century. Instead, Our confidence is in human reason and in our ability to break down the elements of any complex matter into its smaller parts. Because you see, in our world, the whole of reality is reduced to individual elements, as in chemistry or biology. The way to find the truth about something or to solve a problem is to break it down into its constituent parts. In our world, what seems like a complex organism, machine, or process is really only a compilation of individual components. And if we can identify the parts and their relationships to one another, we will discover what makes it tick or what has stopped making it tick. If we get stuck, it is assumed that we haven't figured out all the parts yet, or at least not all the relationships between the parts. This process can be applied to spaceships, smartphones, television, computers, and human beings. This is a very, very different way of looking at the world than it was when most of our theology and doctrine that we inherited was voiced and framed. But our problem as spiritual people is this. Our 21st century Areopagus goes even deeper. In our postmodern, post-religious, post-Christian culture, the model of the truth seeker is no longer the prophet or the mystic, it's the scientist or the inventor. Think about this now, because it's very important to us in a way that might be surprising. In science, the truth seeker experiments. The scientist engages in complex problems and often in a trial and error way. With good fortune and good equipment, he or she may stumble onto the solution or the answer. But what happens when the scientific discovery is made? It has to be shared. And the conclusions must be tested by others to see if it can be replicated. And so that's how it's found to be credible or not. But think about the history of religion, or even today in much of Christian culture. Experimentation, testing, trial and error, debate, they have other names, specifically heresy and blasphemy. Now, while Einstein is revered in the world of physics, nothing that he said is received as authoritative simply because he said it. It has to be demonstrated. In Christianity, the appeal to authority is standard. Because the church and the Bible or council said it, it is therefore supposed to be received as truth. That, of course, goes against everything that you and I have learned from an early age on in this culture, and it's against everything that surrounds us left, right, and center. Most of us are not able to segregate the world into airtight compartments. Science here, politics over there, economics around the corner, religion in that little cubby over there. Now, some people can be categorical in their thinking like that, but most of us here in a church like this one or watching these videos, because we're not able to think that way. All the dimensions of our life need to be integrated, and if not at peace with one another, at least in relationship to one another. So people like us have to have some way of holding truth of personal encounters with the holy. We need a place to hold our wee small inklings of a power greater than ourselves. We need a place to remember the Holy Spirit's capricious cooing in our ear, our blowing breath on the back of our necks. We need a place to hold such experiences while still holding all the other 21st century standards of truth. In other words, our personal experience, our communal faith, and our relentless hope all need to be held and talked about, even in the context of a culture that asks different questions. And not only that, we need to be able to talk about it without theological jargon, without religious language, and in the same intimate, unstilted way that we would tell somebody about anything that we care about, a sunset or a new love. Now, most of us Most of us are not like Mother Teresa. We probably have not had a vision or a revelation with clarity and intensity that she had. We also probably have not suffered the extreme sense of abandonment she did, although I suspect many of us have faced a dark moment or two when it would have been helpful to have God be a more impressive dance partner. But each of us have likely had our small moments when we sensed the presence of God or felt led by the Spirit or sensed a personal vocation or giftedness. One of our tasks as partners in spiritual community is to take our quiet, sweet, and awful, thick and thin, big and small encounters with God from inside our experience and share them in a language that we can understand with others. It's not second nature to us. It's not something we normally do on our own. It's not something we even want to do, but it's something we need to do, both for ourselves and for others who it will liberate. It requires practice. It requires experimentation. It requires intimacy, openness, kindness, courage, and it requires tenderness and strength in equal parts. All of us know people who need and perhaps even hope for community like this one. I'm telling you, we know people who have had encounters with God which they have never given voice to, and we can free them. It would be no different than being the one who allows a friend or an acquaintance to share grief that's been bottled up, or to release fear and anxiety that's been too long held. To speak of the holy and ordinary encounters with the sacred is the same kind of act of kindness. It may just be time for you to meet them at the intersection of their need and your joy. And that, by the way, is how Frederick Buechner defined vocation, where our greatest joy meets the world's greatest need. I think we have a vocation for this, which is to give voice to the holy in our midst, to share it for ourselves and for one another. Peace be with you.